Knight and Changeling, Chapter 17, Intent. Jen wasn't sure what had happened. She remembered something going wrong with her ultimate humongosaur transformation. A mind not her own laying on top of hers, almost crushing her. Everything had hurt, and then she'd woken up in a city she didn't recognize. It was deserted, and entirely made of greens and blacks. Even the sky was green. She was beyond confused. She would have said she was inside the Omnitrix, but it had never been like this. But, she reasoned, she'd never been in the Ultimatrix like she had the Omnitrix. Maybe that was where she was. Or maybe she was dead. She frowned. I don't have time to be dead. I have too much to do. The ground around her began to shake as she spotted a large pit of red flames nearby. The ground near her cracked, and her ultimate transformation surrounded her. You're not dead. Yet. Ultimate Humongosaur growled. Gwen and Kevin were unsure what to do next. After one of the most intense moments they'd witnessed, literally fighting herself, Jen had collapsed in a flash of bright light, leaving behind just the Omnitrix. Just the Ultimatrix, which was dark, as though dead. Gwen could still feel her alive inside the watch, but there were other things in there too, several of them. She would need help, but Kevin was convinced they needed Azimuth to fix it. Come on, Gwen. We know what happens when she takes the damn thing off. What happens if that's what's happening right now? Gwen shook slightly and Kevin pulled her into his arms. If I can go into the watch, I can get her out, at least figure out what's happening. Kevin buried his head in her hair for a moment. You try your way. I'll try mine. We'll get her back, one way or another. Gwen pulled him in for a kiss. Thank you, Kevin. He nodded. Be careful, Gwen. She pecked him on the lips again and turned to the Ultimatrix. With a wave of her hand, a circle of magic materialized around herself and the Ultimatrix, runes for protection sprouting from a circle as Kevin took off for his car to run. He had to get back to base to get to the Rust Bucket 3 and take off for Galvin Mark II. Gwen nodded as he raced away and focused on the watch, projecting her astral self into the Ultimatrix. Jen dove to the side as Ultimate Echo shot a blast of sound at her. You guys really are alive. How long? The transformations paused as she rolled back to her feet. We don't know. It's hard to tell time here. Trapped. Your mind creates this place. If you die, we will be free. Ultimate Humongosaur snarled. Jen blinked and was trapped as Ultimate Spider Monkey wrapped her in webbing, but she didn't struggle as she was dragged towards the pit. If the ultimate transformations were alive, that implied that she'd been using living, thinking beings, not just blank DNA slates that she became. They were alive in here, but she got no further in her realization as pink lights flashed and sparked around them. No one picks on my cousin but me. Gwen's voice was doubled as her pure anodite form descended from the sky and blasted back the ultimate transformations, leaving Jen still tied in webbing in the center of what looked like a street. She descended, severing the webs with a flick of her wrist. She pulled her cousin to her feet, the glowing anodites never really touching the ground. Okay, a lot happening here. First, full anodite form. Since when? Gwen smiled, blank white eyes still conveying guilt and amusement. It's my astral form. I'm a bit more anodite than we thought. Jen nodded slightly. Second, you need to leave. Gwen frowned as the ultimate forms got to their feet, looking ready to fight again. Gwen, they're alive. They might have been alive this whole time. If I keep them here, I'm no better than people like Vilgax. Gwen shook her head as the transformation stared at her. How are you supposed to free them? Gwen asked, her voice shaking. She thought she knew the answer to that question. Jen hugged her tight. I love you, cuz. She whispered in her ear before stepping over to Ultimate Humongosaur. She looked up at the transformation and nodded. How are we doing this? The evolved Vaxosaurian regarded her for a moment before picking her up. She nodded to the others and they made their way down the row of things that looked like buildings, but looking around more, aware that this was to be the last thing she ever saw, the whole place was made up of circuits and things that would make up the interior of the Ultimatrix. It would have been pretty cool if she didn't have to die here. Kevin got to Galvan Mark II without problems. Jen's access codes let him breeze through planetary security, and he landed easily enough. The problem was getting through security outside Azimuth's lab. The galvanic mechamorph would not let him by, so he resorted to shouting the situation up at the lab as he fought the mechamorph. So what if she's messed up the Ultimatrix? She lays down her life every day for nobodies like me. I won't let you abandon her when she needs help. She's a hero and my best friend. He missed his last dodge, and the mechamorph's blast collided with his metal chest, sending him crashing to the ground. He was convinced that was the end of it. Azimuth wouldn't listen. Stop! A flash of light heralded Azimuth appearing next to Kevin. He waved off the mechamorph. You're becoming self-aware, 11. Perhaps there's hope for you after all. He tapped his teleporter and they dissolved into light. Jen stepped up to the rim of the pit, which was filled with flames so hot they were white and red. She looked back at the transformations around her. Gwen had followed them at a distance, but she was still there. Jen wished she'd left. It would make this easier, but it had to be done. For what it's worth, I never meant for any of you to get hurt. I'm sorry. The transformations frowned at each other as she turned back to the pit. Without another word, she stepped off the edge, tumbling into the fire below. Gwen screamed. Kevin and Azimuth appeared at the construction site as a blast of bright light surrounded the spot Kevin knew that Gwen had been with the Ultimatrix. It was huge, and Kevin grabbed Azimuth, protecting him as several crashes sounded around from the light. Soon, it died down, and Kevin blinked. Azimuth hopped down and quick-stepped over to where Jen was laying curled up on the ground around 4 feet away from where the Ultimatrix had been. The watch was back around her wrist, whirring plaintively. Gwen was the only one of the figures still on her feet. Ultimate Humongosaur, Ultimate Spider Monkey, Ultimate Cannonbolt, Ultimate Big Chill, Ultimate Echo Echo, and Ultimate Swampfire each lay in a circle around the unconscious human. Gwen raced to her downed cousin. She's alive! Gwen sobbed in relief as she knelt by her cousin, picking up her head and putting it in her lap. The brunette remained limp, though, as Azimuth tapped a code into the dial in the Ultimatrix. The transformations were beginning to stir, and Kevin squared up, ready to defend the two girls. Gwen was hiccuping as Azimuth did something to the interior of the Ultimatrix. Fascinating. Giving her master control seems to have caused a bit of cross-circuitry that caused the ultimate forms of her aliens to develop separate consciousnesses. I can fix that. He set to work as the transformations awoke and blinked around them. Ultimate Big Chill took to the air, spinning in delight as the others began to rejoice their freedom as well. Jen groaned and they gathered around. Kevin tensed, and Ultimate Swampfire shook her head. We won't hurt her. She saved us. Gwen nodded, and Kevin relaxed slightly as bright green eyes blinked open. I lived, she asked groggily, and Gwen laughed exasperatedly.
Yeah, you don't get to check out that easy, Tennyson.
Kevin laughed lightly. Azimuth nodded as he did something else to the watch. Your sacrifice reset the Ultimatrix, freeing the trapped beings, and with a tweak to the internal mechanics and programming, the new ultimate transformations will be as the other transformations are, blank DNA samples for the Ultimatrix to turn you into. And I've restored master control. Jen nodded. Gwen frowned. When did you give her master control of the Ultimatrix? The redhead asked, scrubbing at her face as her cousin sat up. When she was ready. The Galvan answered cryptically. Gwen looked like she was about to ask more when Ultimate Humongosaur stepped forward. What about us? The only home we've ever known was inside that device. Jen looked to Azimuth, who sighed, then nodded. I will find you each homes, where you can be free. He tapped the teleporter, this time opening a portal in swirling green. Ultimate Humongosaur looked down at Jen as she stood, Gwen hovering. We were wrong about you. Thank you. Jen smiled at her. You deserve a life, too. No thanks necessary. I hope I see you guys again someday. Ultimate Humongosaur smiled. I hope so, too. She followed the others through the portal. Jen turned to Kevin and Gwen as the portal vanished. Is anyone else really hungry? She asked, a slight grin on her face. Gwen laughed.
Burgers,
Kevin asked, tossing an arm around Gwen's shoulder.
my treat.
He offered. Gwen raised an eyebrow. Your treat? He nodded, slinging his other arm around Jen.
Anything for my favorite girl. And my best friend.
Jen laughed as the three of them made their way out of the construction site. I will never turn down free food, she said, smiling as Kevin kissed Gwen on the forehead. For a moment, everything that was coming, every battle she knew she would have to fight was far away, happening to someone else. For the first time in a long time, she'd done something right, and for now, she was going to bask in that. Chapter 18, Unofficial. It amused Jen to no end that when the feds showed up at her door, they outright stated that the normal procedure was to demand that she come with them. But since they knew who they were dealing with, they asked nicely. Finding out that it was Colonel Rosem asking for her was less than pleasant, and she might not have gone if she had known. So, what do you want from me now? And when is your court-martial scheduled for? You know, the one for running an illegal prison under Area 51? He kept his cool remarkably well. My court-martial is until next month, and I need your help. He went on to explain that many a ship had gone missing around the Pacific garbage vortex, including his own sisters. His superiors had ordered him to officially shut down the investigations, so he was asking them to go in unofficially. Jen stood, jerking her head slightly towards the door. Kevin and Gwen took the hint and stood as well. Well, thanks for the info, Colonel. He frowned. Will you go? I can't order you, but... Jen stayed silent for a moment as the other two headed to the door. We'll help, but not for you. This is the kind of thing we usually spend our weekends on anyway. She followed the others out of the room. Rosem let out a long breath and nodded after them. Finding out that the Pacific garbage vortex was alive was less than fun, though she did get to stretch her legs as way big for the first time in a long time, which was always fun. Sending it flying into the sun was pretty exciting, knowing that it would take some time for an ecological terror of the same magnitude to build was nice. Meeting and taking care of Mauve Riedel was less fun, but altogether necessary. Finding out that Kevin was afraid of her was hilarious. But nonetheless, they had prevented her using Earth's oceans to spawn a new batch of clones she'd dubbed Pretty Boys. She'd only managed to make about 13 before they'd put a stop to it. But it all got worked out in the end, and Octagon and Rhomboid were sent back to the Plumber Academy. Getting a text from the unsaved number she knew to be George that night, Jen made her excuses and headed out to the address he'd texted her. Kevin knew it wasn't a good plan. Following Jennifer Tennyson was not a good idea for anyone. He would know, although admittedly, when they were kids, he hadn't been one for stealth. This time, though, he was doing everything he could to not be spotted, following her motorcycle at a distance in his car, which he'd camouflaged so he wouldn't be recognized. But when she took a back street out of town, he swore and turned on Cooper's cloaking tech. He still followed at a distance, hoping the small cloud of dust his car kicked up on the dirt road wouldn't be noticed. She pulled up in front of a ranch house, nearly 10 miles outside the city. It was beautiful. 2 stories with a wraparound porch and a large stretch of wooden fence. Kevin thought he spotted a horse in the pasture as Jen pulled off her helmet and looked up out at the house. He pulled out his binoculars and zoomed. As she pulled her phone out of her pocket, she was checking the address. She smiled. Kevin wished he'd bugged her bike. Then he shook his head and pulled out his phone. He'd bugged her phone ages ago when he started working with her. He'd only used it once before, when they thought she'd gone off the rails, attacking Forever Night castles and alien hives without provocation or assistance. It had turned out to be Albeida at the time, but he knew this was Jen as he flicked on the bug and set his phone in the cup holder as she slipped her phone into her pocket, stepping towards the wraparound porch. George! He refocused the binoculars. There was an old man sitting on the porch. If he didn't know better, he'd guess that this was her grandfather on her mother's side. But she never called Max just Max. He doubted she would do differently to any other grandfather. The man was old, slightly bowed with age, but he bowed slightly as he greeted her and smiled.
Jennifer, thank you for coming.
She nodded. Of course, you're my friend. This place is huge. George nodded, looking up at the moss-green walls.
Do you like it?
Jen nodded. I do, but since when do you have a house outside of Bellwood? George smiled.
Since shortly after your identity was revealed. I thought...
He shook his head. Jen raised an eyebrow, turning to him. You thought...
I thought that, given the opportunity, Bellwood would be a lovely and lively place to retire, truly. Retire if I ever got the chance.
Jen nodded. If I ever retire, it'll be somewhere here, outside of town. George laughed.
Maybe here then. It's left to you in my will.
Jen laughed as though that was funny, but George was laughing too, as if the man dying was an inside joke between two old friends.
There's a paddock out back, and stables, a few horses too.
Jen grinned. You still ride horses in your old age? She teased as they headed inside and Kevin lost sight of them. The audio coming from the phone was still working, though.
That is something even 1,700 years can't change. Perhaps we can race again after we talk business.
The audio crackled as the door closed behind them. Kevin frowned, then slapped both hands over his ears as a blaring beep and static came from the phone in his cup holder. He scrambled to shut it off, swearing as he did. The cloak on his car did nothing to muffle sound. It was possible that they had heard him when whatever field there was inside that house blocked the signal. He took off down the road as soon as he got the sound shut off. There was no way he was going to risk getting caught. He was all the way back to Bellwood by the time he shut off the cloak and slipped easily into traffic. He let out a shaky breath, checking his mirrors. Nothing. He switched over to infrared just in case she'd gone big chill, but no, she wasn't following him. He frowned. 1,700 years? How was that possible? Had Jen made an immortal friend when she got tossed back in time? He had so many more questions now than he had gained answers.